Welcome everyone and welcome to today's debrief of the Singapore Grand Prix. An interesting race to say the least. Lots of safety cars, lots of crashes, lots of mistakes. It was pretty much a day of who could keep it out of the barrier. Now, wasn't too many overtakes on track, but it still made for an intriguing race. Perez and Leclerc going at it at the end there once the track had dried out, and of course some sneaky finishes from the midfield to get some decent points haul for their teams. So yeah, let's get into it, guys. Remember to hit that like and subscribe button, turn those notifications on. We are going to run through the grid one by one, and we're also going to give you our driver of the day and our donkey of the day as well. There's a few candidates for that donkey of the day, so yeah, be sure to stick around to the end. So let's head into it. So let's start up with our winner, Sergio Perez. What a drive by this man. A man who personally I think has got a lot of unfair criticism in the last couple of weeks leading up to this race. Should he be Max's partner for next year? Are Red Bull losing faith in him? Well, do you know what? There is no better way to answer those critics than to do what he did in this race. He jumped Leclerc down into the first corner and led all the way to the very end. Of course, a couple of very dubious safety car infringements did nearly spoil that at the end, and you can argue whether some of them were warranted or not. I think, to be honest, he was lucky probably not to get more penalties than he did, but managed to build up that 5-second gap, finishing actually 7 seconds ahead of Leclerc at the end. But he managed the race really well, never allowed Leclerc to get close enough to be able to overtake him down into pretty much what is the main overtaking opportunity in T7. And yes, just a flawless performance, apart from the little safety car infringements, as we said, from start to finish. A brilliant way to answer your critics. That's 2 wins this year, 2 wins at the 2 hardest street tracks, Monaco and Singapore. And hopefully, yes, he can get some good results at the end of this season and continue into next season with this form. So yeah, brilliant result from Sergio Perez. P2 was Charles Leclerc. Well, what do we need to say? Another pole position that Charles has been unfortunately unable to convert. He is now 9th on the all-time list of worst pole conversions at 22.22%. Yes, not a good stat that anyone wants to have. At least this time it wasn't Max Verstappen converting Charles's pole position, because normally when Charles is on pole, Max wins, because Max has more wins from when Charles Leclerc is on pole than Charles Leclerc himself. So yes, overall though, not a bad weekend from him. He was fastest in a couple of practice sessions, fastest man in qualifying, of course, and looked really good, but just got jumped into that first corner by Perez and then unable to have that extra speed to get past Perez, the tyre whisperer, who just managed to look after his intermediates that much better in the early part of the race. And to be fair, Charles was very fortunate to have that last safety car enable him to bunch up behind Perez and allow us to have that Perez-Leclerc race at the end there. So yeah, unfortunate that he wasn't able to convert it once again, but a solid performance all round in the grand scheme of things from Charles. Hopefully, yes, he can one day convert that pole position to an actual win. In P3, rounding off the podium was Carlos Sainz with, to be honest, a pretty lackluster performance across the weekend. Was never up to the pace of his teammate Charles Leclerc and struggled to stay with Charles and Perez throughout the race, even after every single restart. I think he was quite fortunate that Hamilton ended up crashing on the Inters when he did, because if Hamilton was on the slicks behind Carlos on that second stage of the race, I think he would have had the pace to overtake him, or at least cause him considerable worry for that podium position. So then again, it isn't all bad news, guys, because if your bad performances and your lackluster performances in sports are still picking up podiums, still picking up decent results, then that is a very big achievement in itself, and things can only get better on your good days. So yes, rounding off the podium, Carlos Sainz. In P4 was Lando Norris in a new spec McLaren. A number of upgrades came with the McLaren, most notably a new side pod tunnel, very similar to how the Red Bull looks, and it seemed to do the trick. Lando extracting the performance out of that new car, and yes, holding off a charging Max Verstappen as well. It's not often that we hear that, a McLaren holding off Max. A very mature performance, and one that definitely took it out of Lando. I think he was a little bit delirious at the end of the race as he couldn't stop laughing when answering questions in the media pen. So yes, very good drive from him. Early on in the race as well, he seemed to have the best of Fernando Alonso before his engine decided to go pop, and yes, ended up comfortably finishing ahead of his teammate Daniel Ricciardo in the older spec McLaren. So yes, best of the rest, and a real good haul of points for Lando and Team McLaren. In P5 is Daniel Ricciardo, that honey badger, starting from 15th position on the grid due to moving up one position at the start because of Russell starting from the pit lane. But to being knocked out in Q1 to finishing P5, gaining 10 positions in the race is phenomenal, especially around a track like this. Now, not all of those positions were gained on track. Daniel did make a great start, gaining a few positions, but where the masterstroke came, guys, was McLaren's strategy team. When everyone decided to change onto slicks, and a number of drivers did that at the same time, McLaren kept Daniel Ricciardo on those intermediates, and while they were trying to get those slicks up to temperature and in the zone, Daniel just kept pumping in those lap times and was able to do the overcut. And lo and behold, Yuki Tsunoda ended up sticking it in the wall on those slick tyres and bringing out a safety car, allowing McLaren to do the overcut and jump the Aston Martins and pretty much most of the midfield. So a masterclass in strategy from McLaren. He was able to see it to the end on a set of soft tyres, held station with Lando for a little bit, but as the softs decided to drop off, he was far enough ahead of Stroll, who finished a position behind him. So a much needed result for McLaren, and most importantly for Daniel Ricciardo, because that is the sort of drive that he needs between now and the end of the season to make him more attractive to F1 teams for either next year or if he is going to have a year out for 2024. And as we just mentioned, in P6 was Lance Stroll and the Aston Martin. Another great performance from Lance Stroll. Once again, in the wet, he does seem to exceed in these races where others make mistakes. The consistency just shines through and he picks up those places. Didn't do anything spectacular out on track, but in these conditions and this type of track, Toto Wolff said it at the start of the race, it's not so much going to be about speed, but about who can keep it on track. And Lance Stroll, I think, was the perfect example of that, making his way up to 6th position, getting a great haul of points for Aston Martin, who we'll get to shortly with Vettel in their second car. But Aston Martin have now jumped in one race. They have jumped ahead of AlphaTauri and Haas in the Constructors' Championship from this result today. So, yeah, credit where it's due, a great drive from Stroll, a consistent one, picking up some well-needed points. In P7 was none other than Max Verstappen, splitting the two Aston Martins. Another string of words that I did not think I would be saying in this debrief. He had a very topsy-turvy race, didn't he? More so than any other driver on the grid, I would think. Started 8th position after the issue in qualifying, and then bogged down at the start, dropping himself down to 12th position. Fought his way back up to 5th due to the help of some safety cars, because he was unable to overtake Vettel on track and Alonso. He passed Vettel on a safety car restart, but did get stuck by Alonso. It was only when Alonso's engine went pop that did he make his way up to 5th position. And then he had the issue of locking up big time in a big puff of smoke, some of the biggest smoke from a lockup I have seen in a very long time, down into T7 on the safety car restart, shooting his way past Lando Norris, and then he had to box for fresh new tyres. This then put him to the back of the grid in P14 behind Russell, who had an absolute shocker of a day, to say the least. But on a set of fresh softs, he was able to set some fastest lap times in clean air, make his way through the field. They kindly got out of his way, to be honest. The charging Max Verstappen in that Red Bull is not someone, unless you're at the front, is worth fighting. And yes, he ended up sneaking his way into a P7, getting involved with Hamilton and Vettel's fight. When Hamilton made a mistake and locked up, nearly running into the back of Vettel, Verstappen said thank you very much and slid in there, overtook Vettel on the last lap and finished in P7. Not the result he was wanting. Ideally, he could have wrapped up the championship this weekend. Was always a tall order. He would have to have won the race, got a fastest lap, and ensured that Leclerc finished outside the top 9. But he's got plenty of points and still managed to sneak a couple of extra points there at the end of the race. So we move on to Suzuka next week in Japan, where it is much more likely where he will wrap up the championship. So I don't think he'll be too disheartened about this week. In P8 was Sebastian Vettel being split by Max Verstappen. He got caught by Max on the last lap, but a real solid drive from him. Starting P13, taking that Aston Martin into the points is a great result and a great drive from Seb that still shows he has what it takes to be in F1 if he ever wants to reverse his retirement decision. He held off a charging Max Verstappen early on in the race and was only overtaken due to the field bunching up and Max getting him on the safety car restart. And then later on in the race, he held Lewis Hamilton up for a considerable amount of laps. And of course, Lewis was forced into a mistake, but this meant Max was able to overtake Seb on the last lap on much quicker soft tyres and of course a much quicker car as well. So a really good result regardless for Seb and the team, and as we said, jumps them ahead of Haas and AlphaTauri in the Constructors' Championship. In P9 was Lewis Hamilton, a poor race by his high standards. He really did have a good car this weekend, even though that Mercedes is very up and down depending on what track they go to. But this seemed to be a track that suited the car. He was at the top of the timing sheets on Friday, practice 1, and very close to getting it on pole. Only just a couple of hundredths behind Sergio Perez and 500ths behind Charles Leclerc's pole time. So Mercedes went to bed Saturday evening with a prayer to the gods that it was going to be dry, because that car really was able to perform in dry weather conditions, but not so much in the wet. All year the Mercedes have struggled to switch their tyres on in regards to temperature, and they've particularly struggled in wet conditions, and that's why we saw him and Carlos Sainz struggle at the start of the race, just really drop behind those front two, and Lewis even struggled to get in front of Carlos down into T1, losing that position. Then we have the incidents, T7, where he damaged his front wing, locked up, had to take a front nose replacement to replace that damaged front wing, and then he had the slight little lock up, chasing Sebastian Vettel, which allowed Max Verstappen to gain the position. So yes, a struggle for the Mercedes driver. Both Mercedes drivers who we'll get to with George later on in this debrief. But yes, P9 for Lewis Hamilton. In P10 is Pierre Gasly. 3 out of the last 4 races now since the summer break that Pierre has finished in the points, making up for what has been a poor first half of the season for Gasly, even though he is in an AlphaTauri that is not as quick as last year and is not as reliable. Now, Pierre was running P7 for the majority of the race, which is where he started, but unfortunately he was the first driver other than Russell to be brought in onto the medium tyre. Now, unfortunately, Gasly, due to this, was not able to light up his tyres, get the temperature, get the grip, and struggled on his first couple of laps. Stroll and Vettel in the Aston Martins were able to keep putting in good lap times on the intermediate tyres and were able to get the overcut on Pierre Gasly. Gasly then was unable to make up those positions and lost out on a potential 6th position, which is where Stroll ended up finishing. Regardless, still a points finish for Gasly, and yes, he's finishing this season much better than he started. Sneaking into P11 is Valtteri Bottas in the Alfa Romeo, a rather uneventful race for Valtteri, apart from nearly turning into George Russell, flying in from miles away. But yes, relatively quiet and snuck his way into P11. Started 15th and don't think he overtook anyone over the course of the race on track. Just gained positions due to non-finishers and nearly snuck his way into a points finish. Alfa Romeo still not quite up to pace as it was at the start of the season. So yes, just Valtteri plodding along, trying to get the most of what he can out of that car. P11. In P12 was Kevin Magnussen. A nearly weekend for Kevin Magnussen. He had a stonker of a qualifying, putting it into Q3, and then he ends up coming into another tangle at the first couple of laps. Now, I will give him his due. This time around, it wasn't so much his fault. Max did squeeze him a little too much, thus causing him damage on his front wing end plate. Then Max reporting that damage to the stewards over the radio and then subsequently receiving a meatball flag, a black and orange flag, which Magnussen was then required to pit and repair. Really unfortunate, and as we know on this track, difficult to overtake. Was unable to make up those positions lost at the start, nearly back into the points. But yes, if Magnussen was just a little bit more careful at the start of races, he would have so many more points. But this time around, it wasn't so much his fault. P12 for Magnussen. Finishing P13 was Mick Schumacher. He was running outside the points for the majority of the race until George Russell decided to drive into him down the start-finish straight, subsequently causing a puncture and finishing a lap down from the leaders. Not a special race from Mick Schumacher this weekend. A solid one, but nothing to really shout about. I'm not so sure if this will do enough for Haas to keep him for another year, but writing isn't on the wall just yet. A few races left for him to prove himself and keep that seat for 2023. Finishing in P14, the last of the finishers, bringing up the rear was none other than George Russell. Another set of words that I did not think I would be putting together right in this debrief. Yes, George had quite substantially his worst race in a Mercedes car yet. His run of finishing in the top 5 of every single race he has finished has now come to an end, and it was a shocker from the get-go. Never quite on the pace of his teammate Lewis Hamilton in the practice sessions, and suffered in qualifying due to a faulty brake issue. And then the Mercedes team deciding to give him a PU penalty, which meant he had to start from the pit lane. And this is not a track you want to be starting from the pit lane or from the back of the grid. He got stuck behind Valtteri Bottas for an absolute age, unable to overtake him. Thus, Mercedes taking the gamble, using George as a guinea pig a lot earlier than reasonably they should have done, onto the medium tyres. And it was like watching Bambi on ice. Watching him come out of the pits was like I was watching a scene from Tokyo Drift. It was shocking. Even Max Verstappen came on the radio when told Russell was on the mediums. Oh, that's brave. So he is a brave man. He persisted, and then eventually he was the benchmark for everyone to make a pit stop. But George's adventures did not stop there. Once we had the last safety car restarts, after it, George decided to blindly drive into Mick Schumacher, thinking Mick would give him room, although he was already quite substantially far over the track, and thus giving them both punches. And George then returned back to being one lap behind the leaders, rounding off what was not a good race for George. But I do have to give him some credit. He kept on going, even on those mediums, even after the shocker with Mick Schumacher. he came out of the pits, he didn't retire the car, and he made it to the finish line. So credit to Mercedes and credit to George mostly in wanting to finish that race, because I personally would have wanted to boxed and retired that car a very long time ago. And now we move on to the non-finishers. Now, guys, we're going to start in the order that they went out of the race. So that means we start with Gotifi, Nicholas Latifi, and Zhou Guan Yu. Now, in this scenario, Zhou was an absolute innocent party. There was nothing more really he could do here. He was fighting with Latifi for a couple of laps and then going into T5 just before the big run down to T7, the prime overtaking opportunity. Zhou, while up alongside Nicholas Latifi's rear wheel, Nicholas decided to turn in onto the racing line, or back onto the racing line, and just cut across Zhou Guan Yu's front right wheel, thus breaking his suspension and sending him out of the race. Nicholas Latifi picked up a puncture from this, and then Williams decided to retire Latifi from the race, clearly seeing too much damage, and yes, taking him out of his misery from the back of the grid. Very, very poor decision making from Latifi there. He should have known Zhou was up by his rear wheels, and even if he didn't, if in doubt, leave the room, because that is exactly what can happen. You'd rather continue the race, especially with the amount of safety cars we saw today. Anything was possible. It was about keeping it on the track. So a shame for Zhou and for Alfa Romeo. Zhou has been pretty consistent this year. He's not had a lot of luck by any means with reliability and crashes. He has been caught up in a number of crashes that aren't his fault. So a real shame for them. And well, Nicholas Latifi, you're not exactly going out in glory, are you? You're leaving us with more memes, which I'm sure is not his plan at all. So yes, that was Zhou and Latifi first out of the non-finishers. Our next non-finisher in order is Fernando Alonso, the first of two Alpine retirements today from engine failures. That Alpine has not had a reliable engine whatsoever this year, and yes, this race really compounded the issues that they've had with reliability. Alonso was having a really good race, not quite on the pace of Lando Norris, but he was holding back a charging Max Verstappen and seemed to be quite comfortable. He had the pace to at least finish around 6th or 5th position, but then that engine went pop, which is a real shame. And Alonso, yes, has another retirement this year and will probably be glad to see the back of that Alpine engine into the Mercedes engine of the Aston Martin next year. Then we have Alexander Albon back from his appendicitis and scary operation. Good to see him back in a Formula One car, but there were questions about, was this the right race for him to come back after the operation? Because this was a track and a race that was going to be so stressful on the body, and I don't know if that did play a factor, but Alex did make a couple of mistakes in this race. First, spinning it on the first lap down into T7, what looked like on his own with no helping hand, and then he ended up locking up a tyre into the wall just at turn 5, and thus that unfortunately gave him too much damage and had to retire the car. Hopefully he comes back fighting fit and is much better condition, and has a much better result at Suzuka in Japan next week. Our next retirement was Esteban Ocon, our second Alpine engine failure of the race. It wasn't a good weekend for Ocon. Suffering from reliability issues in qualifying meant he went out in Q1, started 17th position, made his way up to 14th by the time of his retirement. But yes, a race to forget for Ocon and for Alpine, and hopefully, yes, they sort out their reliability issues, or they at least flew over a few more engines from Europe to Japan, because they're going to need them for Suzuka next week. And our last non-finisher of the day is Yuki Tsunoda. He pitted onto the medium tyres to try and do the undercut on the guys ahead, running in the midfield at the time with a potential of points. He completed his outlap, but then on his first full lap, he crashed into the barriers. Just went too quick into one of the corners, locked up the tyres, clearly didn't have enough temperature in those medium tyres yet, as they were taking a few laps to come up to temperature. Hence why the guys on the intermediates who stayed on them, the Aston Martins and Danny Ricciardo in the McLaren, were able to do the overcut. So yes, another silly mistake from Tsunoda. He's quick, guys, but he keeps making these mistakes. That's another crash to add to his resume now, but it's just getting longer and longer. And do you know what? I've said it before, he's very lucky to have a seat for 2023, but with the era of the cost cap, it doesn't matter if you're quick. If you keep binning it, then your team's going to get fed up and replace you with someone who is just as quick but more consistent and can actually keep it out on track. We know Red Bull are no stranger to replacing drivers throughout the middle of the season. So if he continues this into next year, then it wouldn't surprise me if we see a replacement for Yuki Tsunoda in the middle of the season next year. But yes, a silly mistake from him once again, with a potential of points on the cards. So let's get to our driver and donkey of the day. Our driver of the day, guys, and as voted by you in our live watch along as well, is Sergio Perez. As I said at the start, what a win for this man. He silenced the doubters. He silenced those ridiculous articles and videos questioning his ability and whether he should be part of that Red Bull team for next year. That is his second win of the season, the master of the street circuits this year, Monaco and Singapore, both of them in tricky conditions, a ever-evolving track as well. I think those two races alone show why he deserves his place in that Red Bull seat alongside Max, and hopefully he can take this form into next year and take it to Max in that Red Bull. And now we have our donkey of the day. Now there are a number of candidates for this award, but I'm actually going to start off my first donkey of the day in these debrief videos with two donkeys. And the first one is Nicholas Latifi, the Go-Tifi. It was such a rookie mistake to make. Moving back over to the racing line like that, taking Joe out and himself off the race, and just something that shouldn't happen at this level. So yeah, Nicholas Latifi has our first donkey, and our second is, you probably guessed it, Yuki Tsunoda. Can't keep crashing like that. Doesn't matter how fast he is in this era of the cost cap. It's going to cost them literally the AlphaTauri team. And yes, if he continues that into 2023, he definitely won't have a renewal for 2024. We know how Red Bull Academy is. If someone makes a good start in F2 next year and really shows that form, and Yuki doesn't improve, we know that Red Bull are no strangers to removing drivers out of their current positions during a season. So yes, those are our donkeys of the day, and I would like to make an honourable mention, guys, to the FIA. Yes, the FIA gets an honourable mention in the donkey awards, because what are they doing? Why was that race procedure delayed for so long as it was? Are they afraid of a wet start? Are we going to get wet starts anymore? What is the point of the wet tyres? By the time the race started, it was ready for intermediates. Everyone started on intermediates. We should have had a much quicker race procedure, half an hour at the most. But unfortunately, as we know, we still need to get all those corporate VIPs onto the grid and do that grid walk, get their money's worth. So yes, a real shame there, and I really hope that we haven't seen the end of wet race starts, because this race could have been even more interesting with the track development. We could have had more than one pit stop. We could have had wets to inters and then to the slicks, and we was robbed of that. This race is normally a two-stop strategy, but it was only the one. It was still intriguing. We had the mixture of course, drivers losing control and bringing out safety cars, but we should have really started on the wet tyre, and then had an additional 2 pit stops. So yes, that is my Donkey Awards, guys. That is the end of this debrief. I really hope you enjoyed our watch along. Remember to turn those notifications on, because I will be doing more in the future until the end of the season, and I will also be doing these debriefs and some more F1 content during the weeks as well after race days. So yes, remember to hit that like and subscribe button, guys, and I will see you all next time. Bye.